mean, one of the big areas in corrections now is restrictive housing. And obviously there's a lot of national momentum around reducing the use of restrictive housing. And right here in Pennsylvania, we kind of were thrust into this through a lawsuit from the Disability Rights Network and a major investigation from the Department of Justice around the overuse of restrictive housing for mentally ill individuals. And frankly, we were overusing restrictive housing for mentally ill individuals, right? So we and our staff, like they always do, there's a big challenge, step up. And not just overcome the challenge, but set the pace for the country. And as it relates to a mental health system in corrections, we set the pace for the country. And we did that by not just coming up with a game plan on the third floor, but we did that by getting meaningful input from staff members throughout our org chart around how to manage mentally ill individuals. And obviously we put a bunch of focus around staff training. That came from correctional officers at Camp Hill, who said, you're not giving us the tools to manage this population. And they were right, So out of that, we made significant changes. We actually, the Department of Justice reluctantly walked away and had no findings and closed their investigation. That just doesn't happen. But it happened because of the great work of our staff. So at the same time, there's this national momentum building around reducing the use of restrictive housing. And so as an executive team, we really started talking about what makes sense. We brought Vera in to do an analysis of our use of restrictive housing. We presented that to superintendents at the end of 2014, and just kind of the baseline data just described our system as it relates, as it is relevant to restrictive housing. But then beyond that, as far as a strategy, they gave us a bunch of suggestions, and we put together a group, again, pretty top-heavy group, to look at the recommendations. And when I saw those recommendations, they were good conceptually, but I don't think it really reflected kind of a bottom-up perspective. And one of our core organizational values are that we should take a 360 approach to problem solving, right? So every member of this organization, rank is not what counts as it relates to being part of the solution. And beyond that, just to reduce restrictive housing by locking less people up indiscriminately, my concern would increase violence in our facilities and ultimately have the pendulum swing one way and then swing way back the other way, which we've seen in criminal justice policy nationally forever. So the concept is to reduce violence in our facilities, which is the primary driver of restrictive housing. And the reduction of restrictive housing should be, in part, a logical consequence of better outcomes in the facility. But I think what really differentiates us from most systems is how we get there. So we've wanted meaningful input from every layer on our org chart. So we just simply put out that we're going to do this new restrictive housing violence reduction initiative, and we sought volunteers. And I think at the first meeting, which is nearly a year ago now, maybe a little less than a year ago, we had 160, 200 staff members come down from all over the org chart, skeptical because we're corrections, right? And we don't buy anything. And I started off that meeting by saying, look, this is not smoke and mirrors. This is not, we have some solution and we want you to sign off on some solution we have and act like you got input. I'm going to tell you the what. The what is we're going to reduce the use of restrictive housing in the context of reducing violence. You tell me the how. And it was a great kickoff. I think staff were excited. We have an organization that has, basically at that time there was 3 legs to it. Violence reduction, broken down into a bunch of subgroups, focusing on different ways and strategies to reduce violence. Restrictive housing broke down into subgroups on every aspect, from conditions of confinement to programs, to technology that may put us in a better position. And then this third rail on female facilities, because for all too long, corrections is painted with one brush, male and female, and guess what, kids, there's a difference, right? And then we just most recently added staff wellness as a fourth component, because a lot of the themes that have emerged around it are themes around staff wellness and the impact of restrictive housing on staff. A couple other subgroups that I'll talk specifically about, or one in particular is staff training and communications. Because when you have an organization that's this all over the state, 26 facilities, community corrections centers, 15,000 staff, it's very important that staff know and are engaged in what's going on and have meaningful input. So we have all those moving parts, and that was the only structure we had. Really had no game plan, really, if I'm being honest, I had no idea how it would come together. I know we have smart people, and I felt like we had committed people, and I thought that it would just magically work out. And so we just finished our third meeting last week. It's now evolved to a place where we have national speakers coming in at every meeting, because everybody's intrigued at not necessarily what Pennsylvania Department of Corrections is doing, because everybody in the country is doing this, but how we're doing it. The fact that we have, and I'll call it the courage, to give meaningful input to staff all over the place, and to have meetings in a hierarchical structure like ours, where rank doesn't matter, where your knowledge and your perspective matters. I think it's a pretty cool process. So how has our organization responded to this kind of organic, kind of let it form its own direction approach to this complicated problem? There's not one answer to that, right? Anytime you do a structure like this, people in our field, a lot of people in our field tend to love structure and love just paint by number. I call it paint by numbers, just real predictive things. So people like that are probably losing their minds over it. Also, when you empower staff, especially when you empower line staff and middle managers, inherent in this notion of empowerment means that people on the top of the org chart have to disempower themselves. That gets some people out of their comfort zone. By the same token, there's a lot of excitement around this initiative. I mean, we partnered with a group called PADOC, and what they do is they come in at no charge to us, and they take these concepts and they structure them in a random controlled experiment, and then we pilot that in a facility and we measure outcomes. We've gotten over 100 suggestions on different approaches to this very complicated problem, and I think the most exciting part is staff are owning it. Staff are seeing that their ideas aren't just going to some email address and just sitting there, and then we're going out in the field, and in some cases we're having great success. You look at Somerset doing swift, certain, and fair, which is an approach that's been used in probation, and they took this concept, and there's one or two prison systems that are using it, but they took this concept, put it on a housing unit, and it's transforming the facility. In 9 months, you've seen a 69% reduction in assaults on staff. That's what it's about, right? And that's not some idea that came from the third floor. This is an idea that came from people who have the highest stake. I mean, listen, let's be honest. I like to consider our executive team people who are hands-on, practitioners, came up the ladder. We're awful far away from the block, right? And so sometimes policies that we develop have an impact on the people who are on the block. To turn that dynamic on its head and to say, look, you have the biggest stake. Tell us the how, right? We'll tell you the what. Tell us the how, and we'll measure it. And if your idea works, then it works for us. I think it's a pretty cool thing, and I think it's the right way to move forward. You know, new standards on restrictive housing just passed the ACA Standards Committee at the last meeting. Clearly, there's this huge tsunami of energy around the recognition from the field that the way we've used restrictive housing has damaged individuals, right? So that really sets the bar high and really sets an expectation on systems like ours that we need to make changes. But that sounds great, and it reads great in the paper, and it's great sound bites. But when you try to operationalize that through a big system and try to get over the curve, so try to get to a place where the default isn't restrictive housing, it's a high bar, and it's a heavy lift. And it really starts with developing kind of core principles. and not necessarily laying them out, but understand this. Everything we do is, the focus is gonna be on keeping staff safe, right? So that's number one. That's like the prime directive. We're gonna make decisions that keep staff safe. So that precludes just haphazardly reducing our population. No, we need to be deliberate. But also, we have to acknowledge that we need to do a better job. We need to be more precise with who we target, who needs restrictive housing. And what we've seen is that's kind of the default. So if you don't do what we tell you to do, whether it's violent or not, you go to restrictive housing. And the reality is, if we put a nonviolent, just like if we put a nonviolent person in a state prison, they're more likely to come out more violent. It's the same thing in this microcosm of our prison community. So the question is it a culture or a practice, or is it we don't give our staff tools to do anything else, right? And the reality is, this isn't an either or business, it's a both and. Both are true. And Maslow has this quote: if we see every problem as if the only tool you have in your tool chest is a hammer, you see every problem as a nail. And I think that's the perfect analogy for what our approach to discipline has been. So this really focuses more on, okay, let's correct behavior before it gets to the point where someone needs to be in restrictive housing. Swift and certain is a perfect example of that, where we're saying, look, we expect you to do A, B, C. If you don't do A, B, and C, this is going to happen to you. And it's not about locking you up for 30 days. It's about swift. So as soon as you do the behavior, we're going to communicate that that's an inappropriate behavior. We're going to respond, and you're going to know that it's going to be very certain. And what we've seen nationally and in our system is that reducing the inappropriate behavior. Another example is the forest, where they're violence reduction, where they're replicating David Kennedy's ceasefire, where they identify the folks who are most likely to commit violence in their prisons. They pull them into a community meeting, and in this case, the community is the other prisoners, and say, look, we're not going to tolerate this behavior. And if these forbidden behaviors are done on your block, we're going to lock your block down. We're not going to punish the whole prison because somebody assaulted a staff member on BPOD. But BPOD, you're going to get punished. And as a community, we're not going to tolerate that. But implicit in both these things is staff communicating and the system being viewed as legitimate and just by the system users. So I really think whatever the specific solutions are, I think there's a handful of core components. One, staff safety is at the forefront. Two, meaningful staff input at all levels of the org chart. Your position should not dictate how good your ideas are, right? And we fall prey to that often. And then three, it's important that the system is just, and that the system users, that the inmates view the system as fair and just. And the research around that concept called legitimacy, right? And so the research around legitimacy suggests that or shows that when individuals view the system as legitimate, even when they're disciplined, they view it as fair. And so it's a basic tenet, like we want things to be fair. And so I think if you keep those guiding principles in mind and you stay within those broad parameters, that's the what. And then staff fill in the how. So optimistically, if you're asking if this new approach is kind of the next wave where you get everybody in and give staff meaningful input, where this approach will be in 5 years, I think that this approach is a vehicle to get our organization to be the best organization in the country, which is our goal. I think that an organization, people say, oh, the chain's only as strong as its weakest link. But I would say a corollary to that is that an organization is only as good as leadership at all levels of the org chart. And that historically, corrections agencies have just hung our hat on positional leadership. And so we've conflated a position with leadership. And that's not always true. And so I think it's important for people in my seat to acknowledge that we need leadership at every step of the ladder, the org chart. And leaders in the field want to have meaningful input in their day-to-day environment. There's nothing worse, and I'm somebody who came up from a correctional officer on, and if you ask me what my most frustrating moments or scenarios are, it's when I had responsibility without control. Responsibility without control is, the third circle of hell, right? So I got no control over my environment, but if something bad happens, I own it. Not a good scenario. And nobody likes that. But what I believe is that people buy into things that they help build. And in this organization, I want to get to a place where if you want to help build something, we'll find a way to acknowledge that. And that's not to say if we're going to change a policy on commissary, we're going to bring 200 people down to figure out commissary. But I think in these big, complicated, kind of multi-system issues, this is the only way to move forward. And it's not just because it's the right thing to do, but it also brings expertise in that we're not paying for. I mean, we're paying by salary, but we don't have to bring, Joe with the big brain from Harvard in to figure something out when we have subject matter experts walking our facilities and walking our blocks every day. And I think that's what it's about. And I hope that that's the next phase of correctional leadership, which frankly is consistent with the new wave of millennials coming into the system. They want input in their life, and they want input in their day-to-day operation. So I think it's consistent with the new generation in the workforce, and I think it's an effective way to do business.